Okay, so this is the lowest part of Stebbins Gulch, and what we're looking at is the cut through the Chagrin Shale. And the Chagrin Shale is a very friable, that's why it crumbles, alluvial silt shale. And it's deposited well offshore 370 million years ago, and in fairly deep water. So this is the Chagrin Shale Falls, and the upper part of the falls is a siltstone layer, which is much harder than the shale, and that is what creates the falls, is the fact that you've got that siltstone layer that does not erode as quickly as the more friable shale. So this is the Chagrin Shale Falls. You can see the siltstone layer clearly runs down and then into this pool. And downstream. Okay, so here you can see the siltstone layer and the more friable shale below it. You see this is very hard and this is soft and friable and basically crumbles. So here above the Chagrin Shale Falls, we have the Cleveland Shale, Chagrin Shale transition. And it's very clearly visible here. And the difference is that while both are silt shales, the Cleveland Shale is a carboniferous black shale. So it actually has petrochemicals, hydrocarbons in it, because it has plant matter in it. And so that's the main difference. And it's a much harder shale, and it is doesn't erode as easily. Okay, so Frank just brought up the fact that what we're walking on here is the Chagrin Formation siltstone layer that forms the falls. And you see above here where the at the Cleveland Chagrin transition, again we have this very friable Chagrin shale that's really almost dirt, and the Cleveland shale is much harder. We'll zoom in on the Cleveland Shale a little bit so you see the detail, and you see that the color is very different than the blue-gray color of the Chagrin Shale. So this is again looking at the Cleveland Chagrin transition, and what we have is we've got a bit of a seep going on right here where water comes down through the layers and hits the less permeable rock and then starts to seep out. And So what that does is that deposits lime on some of the rocks. The other thing we see here is, even though it's mid-October, we see the lush herbaceous layer that you find here in Stebbins Gulch. I believe those are probably nettles. And it's just beautiful, and it's beautiful green. Looking closer at some of the plant life here, we have nettles, we have ferns. Don't ask me about the ferns. Also, we have this plant, which is called liverwort. And it's a very primitive plant that clones itself on these rocks. And kind of neat stuff. And found all over the rocks here in the gulch. So this is a nice example of a piece of Cleveland shale. You see how black it is. And it's somewhat friable. Don't know if I can break it with one hand. I can't. But, and it is an oil shale, and that's what makes it black. Okay, so this is the Cleveland shale. Can you turn it so we can see? It's black. It's pretty friable, and you can see that it breaks pretty easily by hand, and depending upon the thickness.
Yeah, this is not going to break any further.
Okay. Okay, so this is nice. These are witch hazel blossoms and seed clusters. And these are the seed clusters here. And then these real thin flowers are the blossoms of the witch hazel. And witch hazel is typically known for blooming in the winter and fall months, and sometimes early spring. This is glacial erratic. And they're called glacial erratics because they're not a rock formation that is naturally found or was naturally formed here in northeast Ohio. And what this is this is a chunk of granite that was brought down by the glaciers. So the ice sheets carried these rocks down from up on what's called the Canadian Shield. One of the things I always like to point out about being in Stebbins is because it's not generally open to the public, it remains fairly pristine. And so if you wonder what northern Ohio looked like before European settlement in the late 18th, early 19th century, this is what it looked like. And keep in mind that there were no native Indian populations because about 200 years earlier, the Erie had been wiped out by an alliance between the Huron and the Iroquois. So when the Europeans moved west to what's called the Western Reserve, they maybe found a few Native Americans, but no large settlements. And so you can just kind of see how beautiful and pristine this area is. And it gives you an idea. The other thing to point out is just the soundscape, which is just wilderness quiet. So this is the second birch. This is yellow birch. And you can see the bark is more yellow golden than the black birch. And still very peely. And this bark is actually good to use for tinder for starting fires. Yellow birch. This is another example of the 90-degree cleavage pattern of the Cleveland Shale. We're still walking on the Cleveland Shale, but you see how straight this rock cracks. It's kind of interesting. And you get these flat, almost look like tiles. They're so flat and have these 90-degree corners. So up here through the trees, we can start to see the Berea Sandstone Massif. And it's a very thick layer of rock. And it's probably going up about 80 feet above us right now. But we haven't quite transitioned to the Bedford Shale layer, but we are starting to see the Cleveland-Bedford transition in this area. And so the Bedford is going to have much thicker and less black layers than the Cleveland Shale. So we're on this siltstone layer in the Cleveland Shale that provides a really interesting example of a kind of erosion that is called unloading. And what's happening with unloading is that the stream bed erodes the overburden rock from a particular layer. And then the weight of the rock on either side causes the unloaded rock in the middle to buckle. And that's what we're seeing here. And so this particular bit of unloading over the last 25 years has probably moved a good 40 or 50 feet and used to start down about here and now runs all the way up to this kind of last falls in the Cleveland Formation. This is our first really good look at the Berea Formation, and you see these massifs of Berea sandstone above us, and they're a good 50, 60 feet to the edge. And then we can come down, and here's the stream bed down here. So this recent fall is a very nice example of a chunk of Berea sandstone. And this is probably about 16 inches on a side. Frank, can you maybe step up to it so we get some scale? There you go. You can see the size of it. About 16 inches on a side. And so it's that cleavage pattern, that really square cleavage pattern that was already blocklight that made it a very popular building material. Kirtland Temple is probably one of the best examples of a local building built out of Berea sandstone. It was quarried at the Stannard Quarry on Gildersleeve Mountain. And but the city of Berea is famous for being the place where a lot of Berea sandstone was quarried and where the rock got its name. Another look at the Berea sandstone massif, and you can see how huge this rock formation is. This is a more mature example of river birch that's kind of hanging on for dear life, anchored by some rocks and moss along the bank of the river. And but a very nice tree. So we're now walking on the Bedford Shale layer, and the Bedford Shale tends to be much thicker. It's not an oil shale, so it's not black. And one of the things that's interesting right here is this big chunk of Berea sandstone that has come down from the wall up above. And it's been down for a while. It has trees growing out of it, which is one of the things that happened. But you can see there's several chunks like that in this area. Another nice example of the blockiness of Berea sandstone. I mean, just look at that. You almost have a ready-made building block just right out of the ground. Okay, so this is a new example of unloading taking place. And you can see the crack and the buckling happening in the stream bed. And so this is going to be a new example of unloading as that form of erosion takes place. More look at the Berea sandstone. And what we're starting to see is we're starting to see an example of what's called cross-bedding. And this has to do with the way the sandstone was deposited in this layer. And the idea is that in these layers, this sandstone was deposited in a river delta. And so where you see these deposits that are not flat, it has to do with the channelization of the river delta and the deposits being put down along the slope of the channels. So this is a nice example of the Bedford Shale layers. And you can see they're thick and blocky. And we have some Berea sandstone pieces here in front of us and chunks of Bedford Shale. Just don't know if you can see those leaves falling. It's just a gorgeous spot. So this is a nice example of a Bedford Shale Falls with the Berea sandstone up above it. Just typical of the gulch. And over on this side, we're starting to see the Berea sandstone on the other side. And so really, Stebbins Gulch is a feature that would be called a slot canyon if it were out west. But because it's here in the east, and because of all the vegetation, because we live in a mesophytic climate, a moist climate, it is called a gulch. We're starting to get into the very narrow part of the gulch here, and got Berea sandstone. We have this massive chunk of Berea sandstone that came down, I think about 40 years ago, and we'll approach it. And just to give an idea of the scale, it's probably somewhere around 25 feet or so in its largest dimension. But you can see how it's on its side, has trees growing out of it. It's just a huge hunk. Came down from up there. See if I can negotiate these logs. Nice example of river birch here. That came down from up there, down here, I think about 40 years ago, within my lifetime. So this just gives you an example with Frank and this chunk of Berea sandstone, how big it is. And it's just really huge. And so as we are now getting into the very narrow section of the gulch, I hope that we don't get too washed out with our light. But there's a big turn that's going to come up. Another chunk of Berea sandstone in front of us. And I'm just going to continue to shoot video while I walk forward to the turn. Big plate of Bedford shale here embedded in the couple of river birch trees along the edge with this Brea sandstone formation. You can see the Brea sandstone formation above us. Witch hazel. You can really see the cross bedding very pronounced up above us here. And we're starting to hit the end of the Bedford shale. And we can see the transition to the Brea sandstone. The lower layers of the Brea sandstone are undercut because they're softer and friable. And it's the upper layers that are harder and better used for building materials. And so this is the larger waterfall in the gulch that is at the Bedford Shale Brea transition. And the waterfall runs right on top of the Brea, right on top of the Bedford Shale, and kind of marks the transition between Bedford shale and Brea sandstone. This is interesting. This is some kind of seep in the that's right at the Brea sandstone Bedford shale transition, or just below it. And what it may be is a crack in the Brea sandstone that is allowing the water to come down, and then it hits a less permeable layer of the Bedford shale, and it starts to seep out. And you can see there's all sorts of areas right along that level that have that evidence of seepage. So this is Frank taking the alternate route up these Bedford Shale Falls. It's fun because it gives you an idea of the scale. I'm kind of standing on a platform in the middle of the falls right now. There you go. So this is the top of these falls, and there hasn't been much rain, so there isn't a lot of water. You can see down into the pool. That pool's about 6 or 7 feet deep, and then the cross-bedded Berea sandstone going around the corner. So this is the softer layer of Berea sandstone, and you can see this is a typical erosion pattern. This is a non-typical erosion pattern. It was a carving. I think it was done in the late 60s, early 70s by a local. So this is the narrowest portion of the gulch. Although we're up on top of the Bedford Shale, but you can really see the cross-bedding in the rock layers. And then looking around out to the Berea sandstone in the distance, and you can see this is the main corner of the gulch. So you can see here, this is the softer, more friable layer, which is undercut. And if I go over there, might be able to find a chunk and play Superman. So what you see is this is very sandy because the softer layer erodes so easily. And then maybe with this chunk, I can show you how easy it is to break. Yeah, you can almost crumble it in your fingers. Yeah, because it's such a soft and friable rock layer. So this layer of Berea sandstone was not very suitable for building. It's these layers up above which overhang and are much harder, which are the suitable building material. The cross-bedding in this area made this material not very desirable for building. Interesting feature coming here, which is a side fall. It doesn't have much water in it today because it has been relatively dry. This side falls, boy, it's almost dry. You see some water up above, but it's not so much water erosion that has caused this to move back into the rock, some more freeze-thaw cycles that have cracked the rock and caused this side falls to erode out. And move forward. And this literally is the narrowest part of the gulch right here. And what's that? Yeah, oh, yeah. Frank points out we're right on a fault in the Berea sandstone. You can see this crack, and I can follow it down, and you can see it through the stream bed. It goes right across, and you can see the crack go up the other side. So this waterfall up ahead is actually right on the crossbed Berea sandstone. And that's why it's really just on a slope. And sometimes when there's an algal bloom, it can be very slippery and difficult to get out. Just a beautiful place. So this is the last portion of the gulch. We're almost out. Up there is kind of the end. And kind of an interesting little section. That's still into the Berea sandstone, but we're above the hard layer of Berea sandstone for the most part, and into a more layered formation that wasn't as desirable as building material. A conglomeration of acorns in the stream bed. Looks like it's a good year for acorns. Some chunks of Berea sandstone. I think that's a black birch there growing up. This is sort of our Stebbins archaeology site. This was a hearth, we think. And it's old enough to have a tree growing out of it. It was probably built 19th century. But there's this old aluminum coffee pot and jars. And we find other artifacts from people coming here to have picnics and other types of activities. Probably before it was Stebbins, before Stebbins became Holden Arboretum property. Okay, this is kind of our last look at Stebbins Gulch. We've got some undercutting here with some recent rockfall in this area. And then looking down toward the Crossbet Falls. And our final look. Beautiful fall day. Will the sky turn blue as I pan up? Yeah, it does.